Hi, I think I'm live now. Welcome to, I think, the ninth or 10th of our conversations about theatre of the oppressed. I'm Adrian Jackson. I'm artistic director for Cardboard Citizens and translated a number of Augusto Boal's books on theatre of the oppressed into English. And it's been a fascinating series of conversations that we've had so far. This is the penultimate of those conversations. Next week, the tables are turned. And the distinguished theatre director Matthew Zia is going to be interviewing me, which I view with some trepidation and excitement. But it would be extraordinary to have done this sequence of conversations without speaking to a Boal. And I'm very happy that we have Julian Boal with us today, who is Augusto's son and who has become, in his own right, a distinguished theatre of the oppressed practitioner and thinker and teacher who I've known for some time. So a very warm welcome to Julian. Are you there, Julian?
I am here. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Well, it's very kind of you to join us, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions. So the format for these interviews is the same pretty much every time. You and I talk for about half an hour, which goes incredibly quickly. I raise a finger in the air to try and interrupt you gently if I need to. And in the second half, we'll probably get some questions from people who are watching. So the first question, which I've asked everybody else, so I'm going to ask you, though I know it doesn't fully apply, is when did you first encounter Augusto Boal? But perhaps I rephrase it to when did you first get into the work of Augusto Boal?
No, so the first time that I encountered Augusto Boal was actually the opposite. It's Augusto Boal that encountered me. It was he was the first one to give me a kiss. He was proud to say, and he was also saying that it's a lie to say that babies look cute. They look like eggplants. That's what his precise words.
Yeah.
So it's not only a good thing. So that would be the little biographical part of it, really bio, as in life. When I started, well, it's several steps. No, the first step is that I traveled many times with my parents. By the time that my mother was also working with my dad, and then I was present during workshops. I remember being present in workshops in Puerto Rico, in New York, and in other places too. But I also do remember being in rehearsal rooms in Paris or in any other place. The place that I remember more Forum Theater place as a kid than a place for kids, actually.
Right.
So that was one step. The second step was for me was to do my master on a movement called CPC, the Centers of Popular Culture, that existed in Brazil from 62 to 64 when arrived the first coup d'etat. And I studied the CPC, and I thought that at that time that theater of the press could go beyond certain limitations that the CPC had. Another step was going to Janasanskriti, this largest movement of theater of the press in the world that exists in India. I believe you made an interview with Sanjoy already. And when I spent 6 weeks over there in order to make a movie that I was never able to do, but fortunately enough, my partner did it. But when I went there and spent 6 weeks over there and came back and willing to do similar things. And then I started being the assistant of my dad in some workshops and more in workshops, and then created some groups in Paris. And
there we are. I think we first met in South Africa. Is that right?
Yeah, that's
when
true.
I was supporting
Yes,
Augusto, and God, how long ago was that? A long time ago, I think.
Yeah, more than 20 years, actually.
More than 20 years. But what was it attracted you about the work, Julian, in terms of your own drive to do what you want to do in the world? Why did you when you studied the CPCs, which were centers of popular culture, which were using all different kinds of modalities of generating culture. Presumably there was a whole range of possibilities you could have followed. Why, apart from the obvious reason, why does TO answer your needs so particularly?
Well, it does and it does not. It does from time to time. Okay. So first, first it was, I don't know, maybe it was, it's a difficult question to answer, but, I guess that it was related to politics. First, to see such a movement as Genosanskriti was a drive in which I was very much inspired by seeing, a political line that I could identify with, that I loved, a kind of actions that I really was into it. And during some years, I had this very naive idea of trying to reproduce Genosanskriti in France, which obviously was something that was not possible. And then what drove me in TO maybe was also, at least, for the last 14 years or 15 years, was also to see some problems within TO and trying to solve them. And by problems, I mean both certain appropriations of TO that I don't like, that I don't affiliate with, that I don't think that they contain emancipatory work, but also on the method itself and on loopholes, I believe you say that in English, or certain problems that I could identify within the method and trying to solve them. So that was also a drive for me.
So, I mean, I remember from the moment you started being sort of more active in your own right, as it were, you were quite critical of certain manifestations of TO around the world, which I believe you felt had somewhat lost sight of the principles of the essential founding ethos of the company. Would that be an accurate description? And were there particular deviations, as it were, that you felt were deviations that particularly got your goat, as it were?
Yeah, it's true. I feel from time to time that many companies of TO are like cabs, in the sense that they only move if they are paid, and they will move into any direction the buyers is telling them for them to go. By that, I mean groups that. Oops, sorry about that. By that, I mean groups that, for instance, would. I don't know, who do any kind of subjects, not because they have a particular affiliation with this subject, not because they believe it's serious, but just because they're being paid for this. And then, 1 week is a certain team, the other week is another team. And who gives the political line at the end of the day is not the group itself, it's the state. The state or the funder, most of the time, it was here in France where I used to live, it was the state, but it was the funder that was giving the political line. And this is very problematic to me. And that's one example of the problems that arise within TO, this cab conception of the work.
And do you think that was related to your father taught in so many countries, and the door was open to whoever came in to most of those rooms. And do you think in part it was an effect of that sort of absolutely anybody, whatever their goals and affiliations, could appropriate this training?
No, yes, it was yes, I believe, yes, that, it's the other side, or the dialectics of making very easy methods to be reappropriated and multiplicated. So it have extraordinary effects, and you interview with a lot of people that I respect a lot and that they appropriate in their own ways field of the press and change it. And it's very beautiful that those things are done. At the same time, it gave room for certain appropriation that are, as I see it, really harmful at the end of the day.
I mean, most particularly, you're speaking of the corporatization of the corporate hijacking of. I
Yeah.
remember a very beautiful, very witty play which you were involved in. I don't know if you directed it or you just brought it into being with a group that you were involved with in France once, where our good friend Chen Alon was. You drafted him in to perform it at a festival, and he was brilliant too.
Yeah, true.
But it was a satire, I'd say, to be honest, of a kind of bastardization of TO by a corporate organization that actually just wanted to manipulate. So that's a particular thing that has really angered you, I think, and Augusto, I think.
No, yes, that was the real red line that my father had, is that we cannot use TO for human resources. We cannot use TO in order to choose better employees. We cannot use TO in order to soften the relationship between bosses and workers. This is not the purpose of TO. And that was his own red line, and I have the same one, but I have problems of my own, let's say like this. I don't know if you remember, one of the last times we saw each other, it was in a festival in which they were performing a play about domestic violence. And this play about domestic violence was a play in which, to tell the little story, a woman was serving food to her husband, her phone would ring, the woman would get, very confused because the phone was ringing. The man was getting very angry, upset, to the moment that he beats up the wife.
Yeah.
And then there were replacements and replacements of the protagonist, of the woman. But the play was set up in such a manner, that the only replacement that could be possible were replacement in which the woman had to adapt to the violence of the man. By that I say, look, putting the phones off, so the phone would not ring, serving the food that the husband liked the best, promising a romantic moment after the dinner, saying to the husband that she would take a walk and then come down, and then
So were
Yeah.
those actually the only interventions which were possible, or are you saying those interventions which are all about accommodating and therefore tolerating actually the oppression, are you saying that those are the interventions which a group of TO people at a festival, a European festival, chose to do?
Look, no, I think both. I think both. But I think also that a theater of the press group have the responsibility not to answer to the question, not to provide an answer, but to provide the most complex question possible. And that the people will answer according to the kind of question that is addressed to them. If I ask you, what's your favorite drink? You will answer me water, you can answer me beer, you can answer me, I don't know, tomato juice. It's very rare that if I ask this question, someone answers to me blue or astronaut or cauliflower. The kind of question that you set gives also a kind of a frame for the answers to come.
Of course.
And what happens is that many times, and it's for me, as I see it at least, is a little bit contained in the method itself, is that the dramaturgy of forum theater many times leads the people to give a very individualistic point of view, individualistic answer. In front of, I don't know, of a racist boss, I can do this or this. But it's not about racism in itself. It's about what you can do in front of that specific racist boss.
So these are inbuilt challenges, I suppose, of the methodology, which I suppose the skill is to not fall into the traps which they offer. I mean, when you were talking then, I was thinking that in another way, I mean, you referenced Jana Sanskriti at the beginning, and it made me think of the moment in what is that play called? You know the play I mean, the most
Golden
famous
Girl.
Golden Girl.
Golden Girl.
It made me think of the moment the man raises his hand to the wife, or to the wife, and of course but you're in that situation, something completely different was happening, because you're a great admirer, of course, of
Yeah, I think it's something that's completely different in the situation of Jana Sanskriti because of two reasons. One of them is the kind of audience that they have.
yeah,
When they perform in front
yeah,
of a village, they perform in front of a village.
yeah,
It's too,
yeah,
you've seen it. It's 500 people, 1,000, 2,000
yeah,
people.
yeah,
And so a woman that raise up and say, I will not allow myself, I will not allow my family
mm,
to marry
mm,
myself like this, to force me into marriage. She's saying that in front of her family.
yeah,
She's saying that also in front of her future
mm,
in-laws family, in front of her future
mm.
husbands, because they might be on the audience.
So
So that's
context is so important, isn't it? I mean,
exactly.
context in every sense,
Mm-hmm,
cultural context, but audience context most
mm-hmm.
specifically, because the same act has a different meaning
And that's
in
the second difference, just to finish with this, is that Jana Sanskrit is a movement. And they have hostels themselves for women that will face domestic violence, that will face
yeah,
problems within their
yeah,
families. They can host those women.
yeah,
Most of us can't. Most of us don't have access to this. But what you said is essential for me,
mm,
is
mm,
that we have a set of techniques,
yeah,
but what most is important is the kind of setting in which we use those
mm,
techniques,
mm,
because otherwise we can do the very reverse of what we were
yeah,
expecting to do.
yeah, yeah,
You know, political theater is not political by itself. It's political because of a certain relationship it established with the surroundings. It's not the
absolutely,
technique in itself that guarantees
yeah,
the politicization. What
yeah.
guarantees the politicization is the kind of relationship that is done with a certain context.
I mean, I wanted to ask you, I mean, that brings us in a moment. I want to hear about, of course, the school for political theatre, school for popular theatre, I'm sorry,
Mm.
which you have created. But it touches on that. I think at different times in Augusto's writing, the emphasis on external and internal has changed,
Mm.
i.e., internal within a group or a whole movement, if you like, which is
Mm.
a huge group, as it were, or external, as it were, placing itself in naked in the outside world
Mm.
and facing it. Where do you see the balance of the? Is it making sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah, it is.
Where do you see the balance of that, both in generally and in terms of your own work?
No, look, I think that any movement needs to have spaces and moments of self-reflection,
Of course.
because there is not a speech, there is not a mantra that can be said over and over that will be enough in order to go beyond the internal democracy within a certain group. And I believe that many ways can be done, of many techniques of internal democracy can be used, and one of them can be forum theater. So I don't see it as a preaching to the chorus. For instance, if you had more people to interview, I would suggest, and I will try to find someone from the landless movement of Brazil,
Yeah,
which is the largest peasants movement in the world, as far as I
yeah,
understand.
yeah,
And they use a lot of forum theater, and they say that, and they started using it like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, or something like this.
mm,
And some of them that I know that back then were using it tells me that it was from the first time that were arising subjects like as racism, like domestic
mm,
violence.
mm,
So it was a very important exercise of internal
mm,
democracy. And now, not only because of the use of forum theater, but also because of it, the discussion about race, the discussion about
mm,
patriarchy is something that is quite common within the landless movement. But it also, look, the popular theater school used to run, because now we're on COVID times, but we had 4 units. This year we were going to start 8 units, and with the idea to end up with 12 units. my surprise was to see, because we created those space also as a shelter for people to express their anger against Bolsonaro. But my surprise was to see that in the popular neighborhood, the subject of homophobia, LGBT phobia, was coming so often, was coming so in a such so often, basically. Sorry.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
English is not
And
so
your
accurate.
English is extremely good, but was that a surprise? In what sense was that a surprise, Julian? That
No, I thought that people would speak about police brutality. I thought that people would speak about racism, but the subject, which they did,
yeah,
but the most important in the sense that the subject that would come over and over
yeah.
most of the time was LGBT phobia and women's rights.
Mm.
And so that was a surprise for me. I thought that other issues would come first than those ones. It became not only a shelter for people that were in general against Bolsonaro, but it also, for some of our participants, became a shelter for them to be who they are, let's say like this, to be able to, and also in very rare cases, it became also a place of negotiation with the families that were not so
So
willing to.
so for you, it's kind of equal actually. It needs that internal work
Mm.
within, and then it promotes itself to a certain point, and then it's outside facing. And for you, they're maybe indivisible. You can't have one without the other. Would
Mm.
that be fair?
Yeah, look, we want, that was the goal for this year, to turn from 4 to 8 and maybe 12 units. And
Maybe
next
take a
year,
step, take one step back, Julian, because I've thrown you into. Just take us very quickly through the history of it's 3 years, I think, since you
mm,
started it, and you had a neat formulation of how you've pivoted or changed direction. Just tell us about why did you set this up?
no, I set this up because it was the end of my PhD,
You had to
and
do something.
that was that was about Fiat of the Oppressed, and I needed it, and I wanted to go back to practice. And started to get in touch with an Argentinian mass movement that's called La Dignidad, that I was very much inspired by La Dignidad. And La Dignidad had a political theater school. They call it the political theater school. And their movement, very strong, very big. They are so big, they are so respected within the communities, within the slums of Buenos Aires, that they are the one that names the streets. When the mayor he put the name,
Okay. Wow. Cool.
and they put the name of the movement because they are the one that have the dignity, that they have the respect for doing so. But anyway, so I liked very much this movement, and I tried to do the same thing. But we didn't have a movement big like this, so it could not be the school of a movement open to regular people interested in political theater and in the movement. It had to be a school for the activists. It had to be a school for the militants interested in political theater. And then the idea was that militants would come in from different movements. It was a way of creating grassroots unity from different movements. They would learn techniques of theater of the press, of epic theater. They would learn about Brazilian theater, and then they would go back to their bases, to the places where they do work, within activists or not, and they would start using the techniques. So that was the general idea.
That was the original. And I asked you, I think, a little bit about the curriculum the other day. Apart from TO, what were the other main elements of the curriculum,
So
as it were?
it was theater of the oppressed, but
Yeah.
it was also epic theater by Brecht,
Correct.
no?
Okay.
And some Brazilian theater from the theater group of my father, Arena. We were studying the plays as a way to show how it went away from bourgeois drama. I don't know the name in English of, so
Bourgeois
I'm going
drama.
to say it
Yeah, we
bluntly,
say
bourgeois
bourgeois.
drama,
It's fine.
to epic theater. And then we were starting to study newspaper theater, and by newspaper theater, doing some theater of the oppressed. So that was the first year that was very much inside the four walls of the school. Then we started the next year, and happens the execution of Marielle Franco. The
You
execution of Marielle.
maybe need to explain briefly. Not everybody necessarily knows who Marielle Franco.
So Marielle Franco was a countrywoman, black, lesbian, socialist, raised in the slum of Maré, that got executed when she was starting her first mandate. If I remember correctly, it was the 14th of March that she was executed. And this is, in Brazil, is still more or less holidays times, beginning of March. And we were starting the school 2 weeks after. Many activists were people that had supported Marielle, that knew Marielle personally. Last time I saw Marielle myself was at the marriage of Gel Brito.
Okay, your collaborator,
the other half that started the Popular Theatre School.
Yeah.
And she was there. She was invited there. She was close to Gel. So all of us got extremely depressed. I had to hear to people that were, I don't know, by that time 23 or something like this, telling that they had no longer hope because there was no longer construction that were possible. And then we decided to no longer be just a school for activists, but we became an activist school. We gave a twist. And by that, I mean that on the 14th of April, we started, 1 month after the execution of Marielle. We opened the door of the Popular Theatre School. We were something like a little bit more than 40, with people from the school, people from outside the school. We created scenes that we performed during the concentration for the march. During the march, we were slightly ahead of the march to engage with people in bars, in squares, everywhere there were people in a different manner.
And these were scenes in many styles, agitprop theatre. They weren't forum pieces. They were consciousness raising.
Let me. It was one scene that was an adaptation from Brecht. Another one that was an adaptation of a scene from my father. It was not a classical agitprop in that sense, but the use of it was agitprop-esque. And then it was very good for us because we felt that we had, again, courage to go back to the street, because at a certain moment that was something that was at stake. Can we go to the street? Will be someone with a machine gun starting to shoot at us. So we had courage and we found a meaning in this. So we've done this during the whole year, going to marches not only for Marielle, but against fascism that was rising.
Counter demonstrations.
And against Bolsonaro, basically. And we went into political meetings, we went into the buildings occupations, we went into many different things, movement schools that belong to movements. And at the end of the year, we saw that it was not enough. At the end of the year, we lost. Not only us, but the thousands, 100,000 of Brazilians that fought against Bolsonaro. Because Bolsonaro was elected, and also as a governor, we had Witzel, the governor of Rio, that is famous for saying that in an interview that we are going to aim to kill now, and we are going to aim at the head and bang. He said that in an interview. So we lost, and then we decided to go to a next step, that it was no longer just to be a school for activists, an activist school, but to create, to replicate the model of the schools in slums, in as many slums, in as many popular neighborhoods as possible, and to think that it was possible that we could do grassroots work using theater of the press in order to become this network of workshops, becoming this network of groups, in order to not have just to make campaigns, just to give leaflets, but to be part of the communities we would engage with.
So, I mean, have you almost come a full circle there, Julian? I mean, is your goal in a kind of way to create the Centers for Popular a culture that you wrote about in that you studied for your PhD. Are they similar to that in a kind of way?
Not really, actually.
What is the difference? Just the emphasis on activism?
No, because the center of popular culture, beside the name that they had, were a group that was very much top down,
Okay.
because it was controlled by the Brazilian Communist Party that was extremely Stalinist.
Okay.
So actually, you had a lot of students with big beards, bigger than mine, that were quite fan of the Cuban Revolution. But as soon as they entered within the CPC, they were doing work that was rather Stalinist work. And it was mostly students going to popular neighborhoods and things like this, but just presenting. While it's not completely true, but that's the most of the work was presentation. Why the most of our work is not presentation, the most of our work is workshops within.
So it's dialogue. It's much more dialogue based than perhaps the CPC model was, which had an agenda
an agenda and a very strange agenda, by the way,
and a hierarchy. I'm very interested in a moment. I'm going to start asking questions from the rest of the world, but for the moment, I'm going to ask my own questions for a bit longer. I'm very interested in this thing of what theatre's place, or what our place as TO makers is within activist movements, because I think it's a challenge that we all have. Where are we going to be most useful? And I think you said when we spoke earlier in the week that one of the things was of the new version of the school is to try and ensure that cultural forms really took root in these movements rather than just be a sort of add-on. Is that the way you're going at it now?
Yes, it's my bet. It's my bet. Is the bet of the Popular Theatre School that look, it's going to be a slightly longer answer maybe, but basically, many people make a comparison between Bolsonaro and dictatorship, and they are right in many things. I'm not, well, you certainly know, but maybe I should say that Bolsonaro keeps on praising people that tortured, praising the dictatorship. There is almost 3,000 high-rank officers in the government. So there is many things that looks like the Brazilian dictatorship from 64, no? But there's one thing that is very different, is that the Brazilian dictatorship of 64, and that's not me praising it at all, but in order to make money, they had to create industries. And they created a lot of industries, including car factories. And within those car factories, there were big unions. And within those big unions, started to have a figure like Lula and the Workers' Party itself, and which was something that was needed in order to fight against the dictatorship and to end with the dictatorship. If you look at Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro will not create one job in the country. There is no longer this need to pass by factory in order to make that value will become more value. To create money, you don't pass by factories. So there won't be an industrialization of Brazil, and there won't be jobs that are created. And people will be left with anything, because one way of creating money right now, of creating value right now, is to destroy rights, both in Britain, in Great Britain, and in Brazil. And in Brazil also is to destroy nature. So people will be left with even less that they have. So where are the space where you can organize people when you don't have a factory, when you don't have those working plants? And the bet of the Popular Theatre School is that one of those spaces in which you can organize people is by culture itself, is by theatre itself.
And placing that within movements, as it were, planting the seed within movements. Now, it makes a lot of sense. There's so much to ask and talk about. I should give you one or two questions from the rest of the world for the moment. And so there's Peter Lindley, who you may know, is asking about I think, in fact, he's really hinting to your father famously used to quote Che Guevara and talk about solidarity means running the same risks. Um, and that isn't to say your father always said that he always ran the same risks or whatever. It's a high bar. What are your thoughts about now that quotation in terms of, well, your life now and the lives of people around the world making TO? Are there places where it's simply too dangerous to become
No,
involved?
yeah, there is. Look, for instance, there is one of our forum theater play was about precisely trying to make an homage, trying to make a tribute to Marielle Franco in a neighborhood that was controlled by the militia. Militia,
Right,
it's police, rogue police
right.
that controls neighborhoods. It's no longer that they sell drugs, which they can occasionally do, but it's more on controlling the neighborhood, and every goods that is sold, they will have a tax on it. So there was, this forum theater play about a group of people willing to make a tribute to Marielle Franco and not being able to because it would be far too dangerous for them. This play had two versions. One in which we were naming Marielle and naming the militia, and that play could be done in many different places, except in militia areas, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we try to have a calculation. We try to talk with ours and say, look, what's the kind of play that can be done in your area? And they will tell us, no, this play you can do because this play, if you do this play, it's obviously something that is not possible. I'm not 100%. I don't 100% agree with this sentence of Che Guevara. I believe that yes, you can have very easily fake solidarity, but I also believe that if you talk to Tren, I guess that Tren is very happy to have an international network that is so big that is concerned about what's happening in Palestine, that is concerned on what's happening with one of the refusnik, one of those Israeli soldiers that refused to go in jail, and that refused to go in the occupied territories and end up in jail. You know very well that the daughter of Khan went to jail. To sit back and just watch because we are not running the same risk would be something that would be not a clever move, I believe.
No, I mean, it was always a very high bar, as we would say. And I don't think I ever read, I mean, people are fond of quoting it, and I don't think I ever read a suggestion that Augusto thought that at all times we could all live up to that. But I suppose it speaks of the risk in a kind of way. It seems to me when you speak about local people knew what they could and couldn't do. They're choosing their risk. They choose their risk, and we all know our area. Of course, if one was encouraging people to do something which one wasn't going to do and didn't run the same risk oneself, that would be
I think it was
problematic.
more about that, about not telling to people what they should do if you are not going along with those people.
I should field you some more questions. Ken is listening, by the way. Um, um, Yes, it was very interesting yesterday when reading your document about the history. You end with a quote, I think, from Walter Benjamin, which sent with a fantastic arcades project, which sent me back to it. And he has some fantastic definitions in there. I'm trying to remember. He has a definition of catastrophe, which I think is the same thing continuing as before.
Exactly.
My colleague Gita has a question which is very pertinent to that and pertinent to this political moment, I suppose. And she's saying part of society can't wait to get back to normal, and others want to build back differently and to use this upheaval to challenge old systems, structures, and oppressions. What do you think is the role of TO in showing that different is possible and also desirable to those who perhaps don't see things that way? So this is partly about enabling other people to see that another world is possible.
No, it's a difficult question because you know the post-COVID world is, if you look at it from Brazil, seems yet something that maybe next year, at some point next year.
Even
And
here, we're still mid-COVID. We're all mid-COVID. Let's face it.
yeah, in England too, yeah. So it's very difficult to envision this coming back to a normal that was not normal. And to talk about the role of TO in that, I don't know. Look, I think that yes, this normal in many places in Brazil, this normal was a catastrophe. It was something horrible, and that we should not go back into that. I think that in order to resist that, we will have to gather. We will have to gather among many people, and it's not going to be easy. Alliance work is a really complicated alliance, but I think that we need strength. I don't know. It's a very generic answer that I'm giving.
I suppose to follow on from that, or connected with that, I was very interested how, for you, the death of Marielle Franco was a catalyst. I was wondering also whether Black Lives Matter. I know you've just come from Brazil too. You're in Paris now, but I was wondering also whether Black Lives Matter was a big catalyst in Brazil, as I hope and believe it is being here.
So there was marches in Brazil following the beautiful example of the US who started that, and there was some marches, but the extent of them was not so big. But they were important. They were symbolically very important, because it was a time in Brazil in which every week there was a demonstration in support of Bolsonaro and in support of the return to a dictatorship. Coming back to the streets, even though if there was not massive presence of people, it was not very big marches. In Rio, it was 2 marches. Each one of them were 1,000 people, which for Rio perspective is not a very big march. Maybe the second one was slightly largest, but still it was not a massive thing. But it was very important to put a stop on this, that the streets are not only for Bolsonaro supporters.
To reclaim the streets, as we would say.
To reclaim the street was extremely important. But in the situation of the COVID, but with the fear of the repression, but for many reasons, they were not as big as in the US. Also because it's something that happened in the US, and therefore maybe the shock was not so big for a Brazilian perspective. I don't know. I cannot.
You touched on this earlier, and because you spoke about your shock at young 23-year-old people saying we have no hope. And Eva Hunt has an interesting question here. When the opposition and violence is so strong in Brazil at the moment, what is the balance between TO rehearsing models of activism but also offering models of hope for the future? How do we activate the silent majority, she says?
Look, by organizing, we have people that never went into any kind of organization before, and that they're joining organization through the popular theater school, and because of that, they're joining other organizations, or they just remain within the popular theater school. But by doing theater, it's also a kind of activism, and by growing stronger. Look, it is violent. It is extremely violent, but the violence doesn't come only as a backlash in Brazil. It's not because I'm going to take a flag and wave the flag that you will have a backlash. You have this because you live in certain neighborhoods. You have this. Look, let me tell you.
What is our function in providing hope or possibilities of hope that another world is possible, or do you not see that as a TO?
So, look, the hope is. I think that the hope have no room in stage, because to put hope right now in stage is to lie. The hope is not on stage. The hope is on organizing people to create stage in which they're going to display as beautiful and as smartly as possible. By that I mean that if you are able to put teens or young adults that create beauty, and by beauty is that this is showing that they are smart, that they are the one that should have been destroyed by the system as it is, but they are here and they are smart, they are bright, they have a lot of brains and a lot of sensibility to create beautiful scenes. And you create an organization on the other side that can sustain this hope.
That is a model.
That is that's where the hope, but it's not on stage in the sense of telling a nice
No,
story.
no, no. So it's hope in action. It's hope
in action.
In action, by showing, and that's the model.
As I said once, we don't have hope. We try to construct it. It's a different thing. I work with kids that are waking up by machine guns from the police. That the doors are slammed by the police that doesn't have a mandate in order to enter, and that wake them up with the butts of the rifles. How can I ask them to have hope?
Yeah, but you're talking about the manifestation of hope being the creation. I'm so glad to hear you use the word beauty and how important beauty is to you, because I think it's a foundation stone of TO, and I think it's one of the things which sets it about, that we believe in the concept of beauty, and we believe in everybody's right to create beauty and make beauty. We have comparatively little time, and there's so many questions. I have to ask you this one because it's become a regular feature of these conversations. The same guy asks the same question every time, our friend Amit Ron. I warned you about this. What's your definition of the oppressor and what his theatrical role is? And why he asks this is because we've spoken to a number of people who are, to different degrees, interested in the oppressor and why they oppress. Some aren't, some are. Where are you on this spectrum?
No, basically it's like this. I try to do forum theater plays without oppressors on it. Why? Because most of the time it have a tendency to become a very individualistic thing, and then we are talking about the use of power and not of power itself. So what I try to give an example, talking about police, okay, so I was just talking about police. So I put a police officer on stage, or they put a police officer on stage. And then you go to the police officer and you try to convince him to not commit the black genocide that's going on in Brazil for years. You try to have the good argument, or you try to have the good joke, as if it was a rhetorical, how you call that, a rhetorical question to solve oppression, a joke contest in order to, and it can have a role. It can have a role from time to time, this. But from time to time it doesn't, and from time to time it conveys the idea that we just need to have a good argument, a good discussion in order to solve all the things. What I try to put on stage is not the oppressor, but I try to put on stage oppressed people in the definition that my father gave of oppressed people in the book Rainbow of Desire. People that are subject, how you call that in English? I'm sorry. Subversivos, submissive subversives.
Right.
People that have the will to change and have also the will not to change.
Right.
The will to maintain the catastrophe, as you would say it in Benjamin's term. Maintains the status quo. And to show those contradictions within those characters, and to have one character trying to achieve alliance, but and trying to therefore talk with other oppressed, but other oppressed not because they are willingly, not because they're evil, but somehow they do maintain oppression for a certain reason.
So I think it's so interesting what you're saying here, because it goes to the heart of, I mean, we've looped back to the same place, the delicacy of the dramaturgy, really, in a kind of way. You have to really get that balance right, because the tool is fantastically useful, but if you use it in a very crude way, it may come out it may come out in a very crude form. It was interesting to hear you talk about people who do jokes, if you see what I mean, as a way of fighting, because of course there is also a wonderful release on stage, isn't there, when we laugh together at the oppressor. So
Mhm.
it has its place, but
Yeah, no,
it's not
I'm not denying it.
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
denying it. From time to time, to be able to speak truth to power
yes,
and stuff like this,
yeah,
it's important.
and to laugh
But
at
if
power.
that's the only scope, if that's the only frame that you give,
Yeah,
it can give the impression that it would be just a question to solve
yeah,
by
simplistic.
having
It's
discussion.
simplistic.
Just to give an example that have nothing to do with Theo, it's Varoufakis,
Yes,
former
mhm.
Minister of
Agree. Yeah,
Economy
yeah,
in Greece by the time that Greece was confronting
yeah,
EU. And he said that once he went into a meeting, there was a lot of Minister of Economy from different places of Europe. And then he started talking, trying to convince them that it would be good if the debt of Greece was not repaid, that it would be better for the economy. And he said it and said it and said it. And he's a very brilliant economist, I've
yeah,
heard.
yeah.
And at the end of his magnificent talk, one of those ministers, I don't, he didn't name it, came to him and said, "You might be right, but we are going to destroy you anyway." It's
Mm,
not about convincing people.
mm,
It's about creating power in order
mm,
to have a counterpower. It's not about
mm.
convincing the other.
The forum works on so many levels, doesn't it? I
It,
mean, it works on an actual level, a symbolical level, a demonstrative level, and all those levels are also areas where it may not work, if you see what I mean. I think I have time for perhaps one more question, and then I want to give you space to say anything you don't feel you've said so far. Um, so apologies if I'm not asking everybody's questions. Gavin Crichton is asking a quite general question, I suppose. Do you think the concept of dialogue has changed over the years in TO? What does dialogue mean to you now? Who should this dialogue be between?
no, so it's coming back to the same thing in a different manner
Yeah,
than the
yeah,
previous
yeah,
one
yeah. That's right.
about this. If it's that dialogue, I don't believe in dialogue between a boss and a worker. I believe in better working laws. I don't believe, in general at least, I don't believe in dialogue between an abuser and a victim of domestic violence. I don't think that is just to sit over the table to give each other hands and we're going to solve domestic violence with a nice talk. I
Yeah,
believe in better hostels,
yeah,
more hostels for women that are victim of domestic violence, and not only this, in different laws that would make that it's the husband that leave the house and not the wife, for instance. So I believe in different society and not just different individuals within the society.
mm,
So dialogue is something that is needed, but is needed among people that have interest in oppressed, that have interest in changing the society as it is. And then yes, and maybe oppressed that are not oppressed from the same oppression, but that do need to be in dialogue, that do need to be in alliance in order to construct the society in a different way. But a dialogue between people that are in a antagonist in the
mm.
society, I don't believe this is the dialogue that are going to solve everything.
So as you say, it returns to our question and sort of to an extent of internal and external. But
It's
it
dependent on
also
what you're. Yeah.
well, I mean that okay, maybe that's the wrong word. You're speaking about dialogue amongst the oppressed as the first port of call, as the most
Mm-hmm.
important place to have that dialogue. And I think interestingly, you're referring really back to the roots of TO when your father, in your father's earliest writings, about it as a process of conscientization. So
Mm-hmm.
the oppressed who don't even know fully how oppressed they are, discovering that, using TO as a
Mm-hmm.
process for understanding all that, um, which sort of takes it right back to its roots. Um, we've got just a few minutes left. I'm wondering if there's things you felt we haven't spoken about, which you feel are important to speak about um, at this particular moment in terms of your work or in terms of the TO movement, such as it is. We haven't spoken much about the TO movement in the world and whether that, the extent to which that can make a difference or not, or exists or
Is
not?
that thinking about it more now that you're saying it, is that, and I might be wrong, within, you had Barbara Santos that she spoke on, I guess, she spoke about the Magdalenas.
She spoke about the
Uh,
Magdalenas.
which is a network of feminist theater of the press group. But beside that, uh, I think that there is less meetings that there used to be. Maybe it's a wrong impression because
Yeah,
I don't go so often to them.
yeah.
Maybe, but in
Well,
order
there's been a brief resurgence recently with a
mm,
number of international virtual meetings.
oh
Yeah,
yeah, true, true, true. But for a movement to exist, uh, I think it doesn't exist, and I don't think if it's a problem,
yeah, yeah,
that
yeah,
it doesn't exist.
yeah.
For me, how to say that? It's important to have, obviously, inner discussions about, a feminist theater of the oppressed, an anti-racist theater of the oppressed, an anti-capitalist theater of the oppressed, and so on and so on. But I think that more important even, or that's my point of view, is to have theater press used by anti-capitalist organization, a
Mm,
theater of the press used by anti-racist organization, theater of the press
mm,
used by feminist organization that exists worldwide. So both are important, but I consider personally, I consider that both are important actually, because from time
mm,
to time, together with people that have similar methodological problems, questions, and things,
mm.
it's
Yeah,
important to exchange.
yeah,
But the ultimate goal would be to, for me at least, to have mass organizations using TO rather than to reproduce only
mm,
within TO the subjects that those mass organizations are already dealing with.
yeah,
Um, about things that I've said, and that I would like to go slightly deeper. No, just about the idea of the submissive, subversive characters. Is like, instead of, for instance, taking a Brazilian subject, instead of talking with the guy that have a lot of money and that is buying the areas inside the slum in order to make gentrification inside the slum, let's talk with the guys that on one side are receiving some benefits out of the gentrification and on the other side are not. The moto taxi, the guy, the driver, motor driver, that on one side is earning more money because of the gentrification and at the same time might be expelled of
mm,
the slum because of gentrification. Instead of talking with the rapist, which I think it's pointless,
yeah,
let's try to talk. And I'm talking here about what a scene that was created by a group of women in a workshop. They made a scene in which a woman was trying to achieve alliance with other women, and another woman that she was reaching out for, she was not able to recognize the rape that suffered a friend of her, because that would mean that she had to recognize the rape that she suffered herself.
mm,
So she could, on one side, she was submissive,
mm,
but on the other side, she was subversive. She didn't want rape to happen. She could not just recognize that that was rape. You understand what I'm saying? So in order to have those more contradictory characters, I think that we should follow this very big tip of my father of thinking of possible allies as people that are submissive, subversive.
mm,
And last but not least at all, I would like to speak a little bit about the Brazilian political situation, saying that right now the stake for a coup d'etat is not as big as it was 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, it seems.
mm,
But still, the question of if Brazil is a democracy or not is a question that is still on the table,
mm,
because, as I said, there is almost 3,000 high-rank officers from the army that are in state right now, that are in power right now, and I doubt very strongly that they will very happily give up the power that they received just because people voted the other way. And I strongly doubt that Bolsonaro will be very easily accepting the result of the election, because anyone else winning that is not him means that he might end up in jail. and that's something that he doesn't want to. So neither him nor the army will be willing to give up power within 2 years. And that's a very big problem for Brazil, but it's a very big problem for the world, because the only project that they have right now is in order to make money, to destroy workers' rights, which is a problem for Brazilian workers, but is also to destroy the nature. And that's not a problem for Brazilian only. I know you saw the pictures of São Paulo covered by the ashes of the Amazon forest, coming from the Amazon forest. And São Paulo is 1,000 kilometers away from the Amazon covers, and still it was covered. The day became night. There were so many ash that the day became night. And if the Amazon forest turns into a savanna, it's going to be a worldwide problem. And COVID will be just an appetizer. Not to be over dramatic, because I don't think that's over dramatic. So what's happening in Brazil right now is extremely dangerous, not only for Brazil. So I urge people to have a look at what's happening, and maybe they don't run the same risk, but to be in solidarity nevertheless.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. I mean, one of the things coming out of this conversation is a complexity. That TO is about revealing complexity and understanding complexity, but at the same time there are these so simple things. And when you speak of the international movement, I mean, thank God there was an international movement when your father was imprisoned, because they were able to make some noise. And I'm glad to hear this appeal from you now, because I think with so many things going on, many of us simply have turned our eyes away from this mass eco-terrorism which is taking place under Mr. Bolsonaro's watch, and it is truly shocking, and we must all take some kind of action against that. I'm afraid we're already over time. It's been so nice to talk to you, Julian.
It was really lovely. Thanks a lot.
It's been too long, and let's make it not so long next time. And you had suggestions about other people to talk to in the next series of conversations. We want to talk to a very wide range of people involved, and maybe the guy you're speaking of would be good for that. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Take
a lot,
care, Julian, and see you soon.
And thanks a lot to all the people of Carbo Citizen that made it able, and to the people that were watching.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.